this week's meeting, we had productive and frank discussions. Very constructive, very engaging discussion on the global economy, on global imbalances, on non-market policies and practices which have led to overcapacity, combating financial crime, and artificial intelligence. So as you can see, we had a broad-based agenda, and we found common grounds. This is what the G7 is about. You have the largest economy in the world, and we found common ground on the most pressing global issues that we face.
That was Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne at the G7 Finance Ministers meeting in Banff, Alberta. It was held ahead of the G7 leaders meeting in Kananaskis, Alberta, in just over 3 weeks. We do know that U.S. President Donald Trump will be there. But what else can Prime Minister Mark Carney expect as he hosts his first summit? Let's bring in the front bench. Former BC Premier Christy Clark, she's a senior advisor with Bennett Jones. Former federal Conservative cabinet minister and MP Monty Sahlberg. He is the CEO of New West Public Affairs. And former NDP MP and BC Minister Nathan Cullen. He's also here. He's now the senior advisor at Strategy Corp. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. Christy, I want to start with you on this one. The finance ministers and central bankers seem to take aim at unfair economic practices that generate, quote, excessive imbalances in the global trading system. But there was nothing on trade tensions with the U.S. So do you think that this really was a successful summit?
Well, it's always successful in as much as the personal connections that you make when you're doing these things. You know, like I went to COP in Paris. I went to governors' meetings. I went to, you know, things all around the world when I was a premier. And the connections that you make at those things, the kind of the personal connections, makes a huge difference in the longer term when you want to collaborate. And so I don't think there's a possibility that it was completely unsuccessful from that perspective. And I think I think the trade stuff, you can't deal with it without the elephant in the room. That elephant is Donald Trump. And that's all coming to a theater near you soon. But I think in the meantime, I think François-Philippe Champagne did a good job of representing Canada. One of the things he talked about, though, in his comments that I thought was really important was he acknowledged that there is too much uncertainty in the regulatory process in Canada for investors. And that's the first time I've heard a federal official talk about that. And, you know, if you saw in the mandate letter the Prime Minister wrote to folks, he acknowledged there was too much uncertainty. We are a high-risk investment for countries around the world. And I think, you know, if that's part of what they were talking about behind the scenes, how do we improve Canada's investment climate that's just been hammered? 10 years of Justin, 10 years almost of NDP in British Columbia. It's been really tough time for our standard of living. So I'm glad that there seemed to be talking about the right things again. And it's, you know, I'm heartened by it.
Yeah, Monty, how much does this give you any kind of hope that there may be some sort of a consensus when the actual leaders of the G7 are in town next month in Kananaskis?
Well, I'm not overly hopeful. I mean, the finance minister did a very good job of putting a good face on, you know, a difficult situation. But, you know, there was one mention of trade in the entire statement and no mentions of tariffs. Now, he assures us that there were discussions behind the scenes, but frankly, until it makes it into the final statement and the final communique, it essentially means that things haven't gone anywhere yet and there's no firm progress, and that's disappointing. The good news is that, you know, Minister Champagne has connected with probably the most responsible and, if I can say it this way, normal member of the Trump administration in Scott Bessent. And he's a good connection to make. I think he wants to generally move things in the right direction. And maybe he can be helpful in moving President Trump off his hardline position on automobile, steel, and aluminum, because that's going to start to bite into Canada very, very quickly. It's already starting. And, you know, that's going to hurt a lot of vulnerable people.
Nathan, how quickly do they need to make progress on what Monty just mentioned there before Trump comes to Canada in June?
Well, typically you would want something announceable if the two parties were interested in actually getting to a better agreement in and around the big meeting in Canada. I guess I generally agree with Christy that those relationships and conversations can help a lot. yet again, President Trump might be the exception to the rule. Like, it is good to get to know folks and it's good to have those relationships. But what drives this particular president and when and what forces to it is very, very difficult. So it's worth doing, but you don't count on it. I guess, where's our bar being set? The Americans showed up and they didn't storm out. I guess that's our new success for political meetings with our longest trading partner and closest ally. I don't know. We used to say that anyways back in the day. It rolls off the tongue, but it doesn't actually meet up always with our expectations. And I agree with Monty. How do you go through this entire conversation, come out with a communique, and not talk about tariffs? Like that, Canadians are losing their jobs right now. And if we don't settle this thing, thousands and thousands of more will. And that's a problem for this Canadian government. Obviously, they're seized with it. What to expect in the G7? Gosh, I don't know. But if they're going to make any kind of a deal, and I say that in the smallest quotations, the G7 would be a good time to do it.
Yeah, and Christy, do you think that the bar has been lowered when you consider what Nathan said, and when you consider that the G7 in Charlevoix ended with Donald Trump storming out, a photo that I think lives in infamy now with Angela Merkel sort of standing over him and all other leaders standing around him as he sat there. Do you think that we have sort of changed the metric by which we're measuring success now? Because we look at this and say, okay, well, at least nobody stormed out, everything seems to be okay, but nobody mentioned tariffs.
Yeah, again, I do think that President Trump needs to be in the room for this conversation to happen. Further to what Nathan said, he's an unpredictable character, so I'm not sure how much is to be gained by talking about, really President Trump's trade war. He caused it. He created the problem with the supply chain. So I think they're going to need to have him in the room. I do think, though, we should be thinking too about how this really reflected Canada trying to also reach out to diversify its economy with countries around the world, which was a big part of the election platform for the Liberals, and I think for all the parties. Getting, Japan, Korea, those big economies around the world create markets for our goods there, jobs for our workers here in doing so. And those bilateral relationships outside the American relationship are really important. So this wasn't just personal, how are your kids? This was, hey, look at Canada, invest here, create jobs here, and we will supply you from one democratic country to another with things like energy and all the other things that you can reliably depend on us to give you.
Yeah, and maybe figuring out if that leads to something down the road, as all of you have said here.